It is said that in the darkness of war, the greatest suffering often comes from those who should be protecting us. Beneath the guise of scientific progress, human beings became guinea pigs, their pain masked as a quest for knowledge. These experiments, inflicted by those in power, left scars deeper than any battle wound. As the world plunged into chaos during World War II, an unsettling shadow emerged from the darkness. While soldiers fought on the front lines, another battle was being waged in the shadows of laboratories and prison camps. The war's most terrifying front was not only the fight for land or power, it was the perverse desire to push the boundaries of human suffering in the name of scientific advancement. As the world turned its attention to the battlefield, many never questioned the darker motives at play behind the scenes. The war created a climate of fear, desperation, and blind obedience. In this atmosphere, governments and military leaders saw the vast numbers of soldiers, prisoners, and civilians as nothing more than expendable tools to be manipulated for the greater good. The true cost of this sacrifice was paid in lives, broken bodies, and shattered minds. The Nazis, under the guise of medical progress, conducted some of the most grotesque experiments in human history. What the public saw as scientific exploration was, in reality, a perverse form of torture designed not to advance medicine, but to perfect ways to subjugate, control, and eliminate entire groups of people. Those who entered these medical facilities never left the same, if they left at all. The experiments were sold to the public and even to those who conducted them as vital to the war effort. Soldiers and civilians were subjected to procedures aimed at testing the limits of human endurance, survival, and pain tolerance. It was under this banner of necessity for national security that horrific acts, once thought unfathomable, became systematic and widespread. It was not just the inhumane testing on the limits of the human body, but also the distorted mindset that justified these actions. To them, this was the next step in human evolution, the testing ground for a master race. For the doctors, these experiments became an obsession, a means to secure their own place in history, at the cost of countless lives. These experiments were not conducted with the goal of advancing medicine or science, but to test the limits of the human body in the harshest of conditions. What they did in these laboratories was not research, it was abuse, driven by a desire for control and domination. The atrocities carried out were far from any form of legitimate medical science, they were the actions of men willing to sacrifice human life for their own ambitions. But behind these walls, the scope of the experiments went beyond what anyone could have imagined. Prisoners were subjected to extreme conditions, exposure to freezing temperatures, high altitudes, and infectious diseases, all in the name of a scientific inquiry. Others were forced to endure horrific surgeries, often without anesthesia, their bodies torn apart in the pursuit of impossible knowledge. At the time, the world had no idea of the atrocities being carried out. Only a few would survive to tell their stories, and even fewer would have the strength to speak of what they had endured. What happened within these walls was not just a series of medical experiments, it was a violation of every moral and ethical principle of human decency. And yet, the legacy of these experiments did not end with the war. After the Nazis were defeated, many of the doctors and scientists involved in these atrocities were given positions of power in other governments or allowed to continue their research. The horrors they had unleashed were swept under the rug, and the world moved on, as if these lives had never mattered. Among the most infamous were the human experiments conducted by the Nazis, who pushed the boundaries of cruelty in their search for the biological superiority. Behind the walls of concentration camps and makeshift laboratories, prisoners became nothing more than disposable subjects in the most inhumane and gruesome of experiments. Their suffering, justified by twisted ideologies, was met with an indifference so chilling it would haunt the world forever. One of the most brutal experiments conducted was the freezing test. Nazi doctors, fascinated with extreme conditions, forced prisoners into icy waters or subjected them to sub-zero temperatures. They wanted to know how long a person could survive in these conditions. But it wasn't about saving lives or advancing science, it was about seeing how far human endurance could be pushed before the body broke down completely. Prisoners were often submerged in icy water for hours, their bodies locked in frozen states, numb and unrecognizable. Some were left in frigid air for days, their skin turning pale and blue as frostbite took hold. By the time the doctors had gathered their data, many of the subjects had succumbed to the cold, their bodies stiffened, their lives extinguished, all in the name of the research. I still remember the cold. I never thought it would stop. They just pushed us into the water, and I couldn't move. My body was frozen, and I was screaming, but no one could hear me. It was the worst thing I've ever experienced. I was one of the lucky ones who made it out. Testimony from a surviving family member recounting the story of a loved one. If the freezing experiments were designed to test the body's endurance to cold, the medical mutilation sought to break down the body itself. Doctors, without anesthesia and without consent, performed surgeries, some of which were so grotesque, they defy belief. Amputations, forced sterilizations, and the deliberate exposure to diseases were inflicted upon those deemed expendable in the name of science. In some cases, victims were injected with harmful chemicals, left to endure excruciating pain as the toxins ravaged their bodies. Others were subjected to surgeries where limbs were amputated without anesthetic, their bodies torn apart without mercy, while doctors observed coldly, recording every detail as if it were a simple experiment. The Nazis' medical personnel justified these horrors by claiming they were testing methods to save wounded soldiers, to advance the human understanding of medicine. But the real victims were not soldiers, they were the innocent men, women, and children whose lives were destroyed in the process. I saw them come back from those experiments, some with missing limbs, others with eyes so full of fear that they couldn't speak. I'll never forget how they looked at me, like they were lost in a world that had abandoned them. A survivor's recounting of seeing the aftermath of these inhumane surgeries. Some of the doctors, including Joseph Mengele, performed the most horrendous surgeries of all, infecting people with diseases like tuberculosis and typhus, just to see how their bodies would react. These experiments were not done to cure, but to observe, to torture. The victims were human specimens, nothing more. As the war came to an end, the world would soon learn of these unspeakable acts, but many of the doctors responsible for these atrocities were never punished. Some of the men who orchestrated these horrors walked free, continuing their research in new countries, free from consequence and free from guilt. What we see here is not just a violation of medical ethics, but a deliberate distortion of the very purpose of science itself. The experimentation conducted during World War II had no scientific merit. It wasn't about advancing knowledge, it was about exploitation, cruelty, and dehumanization. The fact that some of these doctors went on to lead productive lives in other countries is a testament to how easily history can erase its darkest chapters. The physical scars left by these experiments were not the only evidence of the profound abuse faced by those subjected to them. The wounds etched into the mind, invisible yet no less devastating, would endure far beyond the war itself. These scars, formed in the darkest corners of human experience, cut deeper than any knife could. The trauma these individuals carried, far more insidious, was the psychological aftermath. The invisible chains that tethered them to a life of despair, memories of the unthinkable that would not fade, that could not be forgotten. One of the most tragic truths about the war's medical experimentation is that, for many, the war never really ended. The psychological wounds left behind were not visible in the same way as burns or amputations, but they were profound nonetheless. These wounds manifested not in the flesh, but in their hearts, their minds, and their very ability to reconnect with the world they once knew. One survivor, a young man subjected to the Nazi freezing experiments, recalled how his world seemed to shatter in an instant. His body, left to endure the brutality of freezing temperatures, did not heal quickly. But the true damage was not the frostbite. It was the profound sense of abandonment that followed. No one explained why they were doing this to him. He was not a soldier, he was a man, forgotten, abused. The physical pain of the cold, the numbing sensation that took over his body, was nothing compared to the loneliness, the fear, and the isolation that gripped his mind. The worst part was not the pain. It wasn't the cold. It was the fear of being left alone. No one came to help. No one said, "We are here for you." We were abandoned. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. My body shut down, and so did my mind. It felt like I was in a dream, one I couldn't escape from. I wanted to die, because at least then I wouldn't have to carry the weight of what I had become. A survivor's raw emotional recounting of the aftermath. But for those who managed to survive the physical horrors, the real war began when they returned to the world that had left them behind. The mental toll of being used as a test subject did not disappear with the war. It was not a wound that could heal in a matter of months or even years. Many survivors found themselves haunted by recurring nightmares, debilitating flashbacks, and a pervasive sense of disorientation. The world they returned to had changed, but so had they. Their minds, scarred by the inhumanity they had endured, found it difficult to reconcile with the normality of post-war life. It wasn't just the physical pain that remained, it was the belief that they had been reduced to mere tools in the hands of those who saw them only as bodies to be used. For many, this belief was deeply ingrained. They felt as though their lives no longer held meaning beyond the experiment. They had been discarded, their humanity stripped away. Psychologists who studied the aftermath of these experiments have noted the profound long-term psychological effects. The sense of betrayal, abandonment, and powerlessness was pervasive. Victims of these experiments often carried with them the lingering effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of dissociation from their own identities. The war had ended, but the mental struggle never ceased. The real devastation came in the form of disconnection. These individuals could not reconcile the horror they had experienced with the world they returned to. It wasn't just the trauma of the physical pain, it was the fact that they had been denied agency. They were stripped of control, of voice, and that feeling carried over into their post-war life. They were isolated in a way that went beyond the camps. It was a solitude that echoed in every waking moment. For many survivors, the idea of returning to normal life seemed impossible. A woman who had been experimented upon during the war described how every loud noise, every unexpected movement, sent her into a panic. She found herself constantly on edge, unable to trust anyone, not even herself. The psychological scars were as deep and as painful as any wound. She never felt safe. The world outside had moved on, but she couldn't escape the war inside her mind. The most harrowing aspect of their suffering is that they were often denied the opportunity to heal. Society was largely indifferent to their pain, unable to understand or acknowledge the depth of the trauma they carried. The war may have ended for the world, but for the survivors, it was a lifelong battle. It wasn't just the Nazis who crossed moral boundaries during the horrors of war. The Allies, too, carried out a series of medical experiments that violated the basic tenets of humanity. While history often views them as the good guys, their own dark secrets remain largely untold, tucked away from the public eye for decades. The line between right and wrong blurred during wartime, and the legacy of these experiments lingers as a reminder that cruelty knows no boundaries, not even in the name of righteousness. One of the most infamous examples of the U.S. government's experimentation took place in the heart of Alabama. The Tuskegee Experiment, lasting from 1932 to 1972, subjected hundreds of African American men to a treatment so cruel, so inhumane, that it remains a stain on American history. These men, all of whom were impoverished sharecroppers, were promised free healthcare in exchange for their participation. But they were deceived, never told they had syphilis, and left untreated for the disease, all under the guise of studying its effects. For decades, the government kept the truth hidden from the very men they subjected to this cruel experiment. These individuals were not only deprived of treatment, but they were also denied the dignity of informed consent. They were stripped of their humanity for a study that, in reality, served no true medical or scientific purpose. It was not a study on curing a disease, but an unforgivable exercise in control and exploitation. My uncle, he was part of that experiment. He never knew what was happening to him, and no one ever told him. For years, we thought he was just sick. He was treated like an animal. They just watched him suffer, and he wasn't the only one. They all died in silence, with no one asking questions. A family member of a victim speaks, their voice heavy with sadness. But the Tuskegee Experiment was not the only case. Far across the globe, another dark chapter unfolded, one that remains far less known, yet just as horrifying. In Japan, Unit 731 became infamous for its brutal human experimentation, a program that has been largely obscured by time, politics, and secrecy. In the early 1940s, Japan's Unit 731, a secret biological warfare research unit, engaged in horrific experiments, infecting thousands of civilians and prisoners with deadly diseases, including anthrax and the plague, in order to study their effects. The victims were often subjected to the horrors of vivisection, exposed to biological agents, and left to die in agony. The experiments were not only cruel, they were designed for one purpose: to weaponize biological warfare. The victims of Unit 731, many of whom were Chinese civilians, Russian prisoners of war, and even children, were used as living test subjects, exposed to biological agents without any consent. They were not just numbers or statistics, but human lives, each lost in a cruel, and often gruesome, effort to perfect chemical weapons. The horrors of Unit 731 were kept secret for decades after the war, hidden by the Japanese government and, later, by the American authorities who, in exchange for information on the experiments, granted the doctors involved immunity from prosecution. This unholy pact ensured that the atrocities committed at Unit 731 would remain hidden in the shadows for far too long. I had heard stories when I was young about the things they did to people in Unit 731. They were called logs. They didn't even have names anymore. They were just subjects. I had a relative who survived. He never spoke of it, but I know what he saw, what he felt. It broke him, and it broke all of us. Testimony from a descendant of a victim of Unit 731. As horrific as these experiments were, they were far from isolated. Both the Nazis and the Allies saw their victims not as people but as subjects to be experimented upon in the name of national security, military advantage, or scientific progress. And even after the war ended, the consequences of these actions did not disappear. The legacy of suffering, trauma, and betrayal has echoed through the generations. As the smoke of war cleared and the world began to recover, the harsh reality of what had been done in the name of science and military strategy began to surface. The Nuremberg Trials, held in the aftermath of World War II, were set up to bring justice to those responsible for the inhuman experiments that had taken place. These trials were a pivotal moment in history, not only in terms of war crimes but also in shaping the future of medical ethics. The trials, held between 1945 and 1949, sought to hold Nazi doctors accountable for the atrocities committed during the war. The proceedings were broadcast globally, allowing the world to bear witness to the testimony of survivors, as well as the harrowing accounts of their suffering. The prosecution was relentless in its efforts to expose the medical experiments for what they were: cruel, unethical, and criminal. But despite the overwhelming evidence, the outcomes of the trials were not as satisfying as many hoped. Some of the most notorious figures in the Nazi regime faced justice, but others evaded capture, escaping into the shadows of post-war Europe, where they would live out their lives without facing the full consequences of their actions. For the victims, the trials offered some closure, but it was never enough. The scars, physical and emotional, remained long after the defendants were sentenced. The justice handed down did little to erase the deep wounds that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. And while the trials were a significant step in holding perpetrators accountable, they also exposed an uncomfortable truth: not all those responsible for the suffering of innocents were ever brought to justice. The Nuremberg trials were groundbreaking in that they set the legal framework for modern medical ethics. They brought the concept of informed consent to the forefront, ensuring that the horrors of human experimentation would never again be tolerated without the explicit consent of the individual. But even as the trials concluded, the damage had been done, and the repercussions of those actions have echoed through the decades. In the wake of the Nuremberg trials, international conventions were established to ensure that medical experimentation could never again be used as a weapon of war or domination. The Declaration of Helsinki, issued in 1964, established the ethical foundation for modern medical research, ensuring that the rights of individuals would never again be violated in the name of science. Yet despite these advancements, the shadows of the past still linger. The ethical questions raised by the medical atrocities of World War II continue to shape the way we view human rights, research, and justice. And for the victims, the fight for recognition, acknowledgement, and healing continues. The Nuremberg trials were a crucial turning point, but they were only the beginning. The legacy of the experiments, the pain, the trauma, the unanswered questions, will remain for generations to come, and it is our responsibility to ensure that these dark chapters in history are never forgotten. The atrocities committed during wartime medical experiments are now part of history, but for the survivors, they are deeply personal. Many have passed, but their voices, their suffering, and their resilience live on in the fight for human rights and medical ethics. These dark chapters may have occurred long ago, but their consequences continue to ripple through generations. Across the world, memorials are dedicated to those who suffered in silence. These sites serve as painful reminders of the horrors that unfolded under the guise of medical advancement, but they also symbolize the strength of the human spirit, which continues to rise above the trauma. We owe it to those who endured these horrors to never forget. To honor their suffering not only through remembrance but through action, ensuring that future generations are educated on the atrocities so that the darkness of history is never repeated. In the struggle to protect human dignity and prevent future abuses, it's essential that these stories continue to be told. The lessons learned from these atrocities form the foundation of modern medical ethics, where the sanctity of human life and individual rights is paramount. Visual prompt. As we reflect on the suffering endured by these victims, we also reflect on how far we've come. Yet, the fight for justice, for accountability, and for ethics remains an ongoing journey. It is a journey that demands our vigilance, our compassion, and our commitment to truth. Though many of the victims have passed, their legacy endures through the institutions, laws, and memories that continue to shape the world today. Their stories are not only a testament to their pain, but also to their courage in the face of unimaginable suffering. History must be remembered, not as a shadow of the past, but as a constant reminder of the need for compassion, respect, and accountability. The legacy of these victims transcends time, demanding our unwavering commitment to preserving human dignity. If these stories moved you, if they made you reflect on the cost of unchecked power and the importance of protecting human rights, please share this video. Let the world know that the voices of the past are never silenced. Only through understanding and awareness can we ensure that history never repeats itself.